When approaching a story of cosmic horror like that of H.P. Lovecraft's The Call of Cthulhu, I think it could be quite helpful to have something like an overview of the narrative structure and the sources within narrative that the story is being pieced together out of. And it begins with a very interesting prologue, which we've already discussed, about the most merciful thing in the world being the inability of the human mind to correlate all of its contents, which it's going to turn out is relatively true, but in this story there's a lot of correlation going on, so that by the very end of the tale, we find out that there is, in fact, a coherent narrative to be pieced together, but one that we would do better to not know about. Of course, by the time that we finish the story, we do know about it, don't we? As we'll discuss shortly. So then we go directly into an account which is given by this relatively young or middle-aged professorial type who's going to make a big splash in the field of anthropology, and we assume kind of takes after his grand uncle in a way. He says, "My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926 and 27 with the death of my grand uncle, George Gamel Angle, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island." And so the grandnephew has been named the granduncle's heir and executor, and he's expected to go over his papers. For that purpose, moved all of his files and boxes to his quarters in Boston. And most of it is stuff that, the learned societies will take care of. They're interested in it. And then there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling, and which I felt much averse from showing to other eyes. Now, he is showing it to other eyes in the narrative, as we're going to see. And he goes on and he says, "It had been locked, and I did not find the key till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring, which the professor carried always in his pocket. Then, indeed, I succeeded in opening it, but when I did so, seemed only to be confronted by a greater and more closely locked barrier." Now, it's not a real lock inside. It's not a box within a box. It's rather the nature of the contents of that box. He says, "What could be the meaning of the queer clay bas relief and the disjointed jottings, ramblings, and cuttings which I found? Had my uncle, in his later years, become credulous of the most superficial impostures? I resolved to seek out the eccentric sculptor responsible for the apparent disturbance of an old man's peace of mind." And he will indeed seek him out in the second part. Then he'll go on, and he'll start to tell us about these contents. Now, we'll skip over the statue itself. It's a statue of Cthulhu, but we get that the writings accompanying this oddity was, aside from a stack of press cuttings, in Professor Angle's most recent hand, and made no pretense to literary style. What seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult, in all caps, in characters painstakingly printed out to avoid the erroneous reading of a word so unheard of. The manuscript was divided into two sections, the first of which was headed 1925, Dream and Dream Work of H.A. Wilcox. Then the second, Narrative of Inspector John R. LaGrasse from New Orleans. Then there were notes on same and Professor Webb's account. And then there were other manuscript papers, brief notes, some of them accounts of queer dreams of different persons, some of them citations from theosophical books and magazines. The rest comments on long-surviving secret societies and hidden cults. The cuttings, as he says, largely alluded to outre mental illnesses and outbreaks of group folly, panic, or mania in the spring of 1925. So we've got a box full of interesting stuff, and now the mystery is, as we often say, afoot, right? So the narrator is going to investigate all these and provide us, the reader, with an account of this. And part of that will be this dream and dream work of this sculptor, this very sensitive youth, Wilcox. And so he's one of the, we could say, witnesses or sources. And we're getting this at, we could say, third hand. We're getting it from the narrator, who is getting it from his great uncle, who is getting it from Wilcox. And then we can say the same of the press cuttings and the other notes. So we're going to go on from there to look at what else is provided. And the story gets more complex in the second part, which is starting with the American Archaeological Society and the account of Inspector Legras. Now you notice there's a time differential here, a very important one, right? So we begin in 1925, 1926, 1927, and now we're going all the way back to 1908. And what we find is that the American Archaeological Society held its annual meeting in St. Louis. Professor Engel had a prominent part in all the deliberations and was one of the first to be approached by several outsiders who took advantage of the convocation to offer questions for correct answering and problems for expert solutions. So the archaeologists are being consulted at their learned society by non-archaeologists. And who is this? A commonplace-looking, middle-aged man who traveled all the way from New Orleans for certain special information unobtainable from any local source. His name was John Raymond Legras, and he was by profession an inspector of police. He brings a stone statue. He wants to know what they know about it. And we're going to get all sorts of interesting accounts and sources. So we get Professor Webb's account. Now, this is taking us even further back in time to 1860, 48 years before, right? And Professor Webb had been engaged in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions, which he failed to unearth, and then encountered a singular tribe or cult of, as Lovecraft is going to say, degenerate Eskimos, now we say Inuits, whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. It was a faith of which other Inuit knew little, and so he's going to provide an interesting account. So now we're getting, more and more. Then we get Legras telling about the raid that he conducted. And we get a lot of action, much more action than exposition involved in this, which is a bit of a change, right? So we find that there are terrible sacrifices taking place, and this similar statue is at the center of it. We also get from Legras, so now it's sort of at fourth hand, right? It's narrator, great uncle, Legras, Castro. Castro is an old person who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cult in the mountains of China. And he tells us all these bits of hideous legends that paled the speculations of theosophists and made man and the world seem recent and transient indeed. And I won't go through the entire thing. We'll talk about that elsewhere. But it's about the great old ones, which include Cthulhu, the object of this human cult. And we find out that in the elder time, chosen men had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams. Then something had happened. The great stone city, Relea, with its monoliths and sepulchres, it's sunk beneath the waves, right? And the cult goes on. So Castro is telling this. Legras tells the archaeologists about that, and they don't have any suspicion about it either. So we've got all sorts of interesting things going on. And then in this second part, we find out that the narrator is carrying out his own inquiries. He talks with Galvez, who is one of the people in on the raid. We get this little snippet. He says, "It may have been only imagination, and it may have been only echoes which induced one of the men, an excitable Spaniard, to fancy he heard antiphonal responses to the ritual from some far and unillumined spot deeper in the wood of ancient legendary and horror. This man, Joseph D. Galvez, I later met and questioned, and he proved distractingly imaginative. He indeed went so far as to hint of the faint beating of great wings and of a glimpse of shining eyes and mountainous white bulk beyond the remotest trees. But I suppose he'd been hearing too much native superstition." So Galvez is being dismissed as a source. Then the narrator goes on and interviews Wilcox, the young artist. And he says that, he at first thinks that the artist had been boldly imposing upon a learned and aged man. And it turns out he's, rather a decadent artist. He talks about his dreams in a poetic fashion, and he uses some language that will be part of the Cthulhu cult as well. And here at this point, we see, "I was willing now to admit both his genius and his honesty. I took leave of him amicably and wish him all the success his talent promises. The matter of the cult still remained to fascinate me, and at times I had visions of personal fame from researches into its origin and connections. I visited New Orleans and talked with LaGrasse and others of that old-time raiding party, saw the frightful image, even questioned such of the mongrel prisoners as had still survived. Old Castro, unfortunately, had been dead for some years." He says, "What I now heard so graphically at first hand, though it was really no more than a detailed confirmation of what my uncle had written, excited me afresh, for I felt sure I was on the track of a very real, very secret, and very ancient religion whose discovery would make me an anthropologist of note. My attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as I wish it still were." Then, in the third part, by chance, he encounters a story in the Sydney Bulletin which has a picture of a statue that draws his attention. It is the statue of the Cthulhu cult again. And he is going to talk about this as actually providing a great new wealth or great new treasuries of data on the Cthulhu cult and evidence it had strange interests at sea as well as on land. So we get the mystery derelict found at sea news article, which is fairly long and gives us some information. And then the narrator is going to investigate this himself because one person has survived from the crew. So he first investigates in Auckland and then in Sydney itself, finds out that Johansson has gone back to Oslo. And by the time that he gets to Oslo, it's turned out that Johansson has died. In a way, a little bit similar to how his great uncle had died under, somewhat suspicious circumstances in 1925. And so what's left? Some manuscript, some documents, effectively diary of the events. He says, a naive sailor's effort at a post facto diary, a simple rambling thing. And he says, I cannot try to translate it verbatim in all its cloudiness and redundance, but I will tell its gist enough to show why the sound of the water against the vessel's sides became so unendurable to me that I stopped my ears with cotton. And here we get a first-hand account of the encounter with the lost sunken city relay, now risen to the surface. and of the being, the great old one, Cthulhu himself, as well as, we could say, a little bit of a combat that takes place, which drives Johansen effectively mad. Now, the manuscript is labeled as technical matters. It's written in English so that his wife won't actually see it, but the narrator does read it through. And then the narrator, after going through all of this, towards the very end, in the last 2 paragraphs, is going to place it all within a framework. He says, "That was the document I read, and now I have placed it in the tin box, besides the bas-relief in the papers of Professor Engel." So the account of Johansen is now in there. But there's something else. He says, "With it shall go this record of mine." What is this record of mine? The story, The Call of Cthulhu. He says, "This test of my own sanity, wherein is pieced together that which I hope may never be pieced together again. I have looked upon all the universe has had to hold of horror, so I don't think my life is going to be long." And he goes on and says, "Cthulhu still lives." He talks about, what is risen may sink and what is sunk may rise. Loathsomeness waits and dreams in the deep, and decay spreads over the tottering cities of man. A time will come, but I must not and cannot think. Let me pray that, if I do not survive this manuscript, my executors may put caution before audacity and see that it meets no other eye. Now, in the narrative world, since we are encountering this, what would we be? We would either be the executors themselves. There's no hint of that, though. Or we would be others, perhaps anthropologists, perhaps archaeologists, perhaps the learned public at large, reading this curious account. So the narrative is folded in on itself and offered to us, its readers, and that is part of its structure. So we have a number of fictional sources cited as if they are all real, and they've been verified and correlated by this narrator, producing an effect, hopefully, as you read it, of cosmic horror.